Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. About a year ago, life was pretty quiet in my neck of the woods. I'd lived on this plot for about 15 years, long enough that the trees I planted when I first moved in were now casting shade. It wasn't a big place, just a little over an acre, but it was mine. A gravel driveway snaked down to the house, and beyond that, there was a thick patch of forest where I liked to hike. On weekends, I'd work on the yard or sit on the porch with my dog, Boone. Then Karen moved in next door. I met her the day she arrived. Mid-50s, short, blonde, with an attitude so sharp you could slice bread with it. She acted friendly enough, but something about the way she looked around made me uncomfortable. She sized up everything, eyes lingering on my yard a bit too long. At the time, I chalked it up to curiosity, but looking back, I should have trusted my gut. That woman had plans. A few weeks went by and I noticed some changes. First, there was the construction noise. One morning, Boone and I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. I looked out my window, and to my horror, there was a bulldozer plowing through the far edge of my property, right where the forest started. I rushed outside, waving my arms like a lunatic. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled at the guy in the bulldozer. He killed the engine and looked down at me, shrugging. "Talk to Karen," he said, nodding toward her place. I stormed over to her house. Karen met me on her porch, arms crossed, like she'd been expecting me. "I'm building a road," she said, matter-of-factly. "Through my property? Technically, it's not your property," she replied with a smug grin. "There's an easement here." I was floored. No one had ever mentioned an easement. The whole thing sounded sketchy, so I told her as much. "I'm going to get a surveyor," I said. Karen rolled her eyes and made a point of dialing her phone. "Go ahead. But if you keep trespassing on my project, I'm calling 911. She wasn't bluffing. Karen loved her 911 threats. Anytime there was the slightest disagreement, she'd whip out her phone like she was about to report me for breathing too close to her property line. The way she said it made me think she did this a lot. Anyway, I hired the surveyor just as I'd promised. Turns out Karen had been lying through her teeth. There was no easement. That road? 100% on my land. I marched over to her place, paper in hand, feeling victorious. She took one look at the report and smirked. "Well, it's there now," she said, shrugging. "What are you going to do about it?" At this point, I was livid. I thought about calling the cops on her right then and there, but I knew she'd spin some story about the easement, and it would turn into a drawn-out legal battle. And that's when I started planning my revenge. You see, Karen's road wasn't exactly legal. She hadn't gone through the proper channels for permits, which I found out after a few calls to the local county office. She was one of those people who assumed she could bulldoze, literally, over regulations and do whatever she wanted. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I reported the road. The county sent out an inspector the next week. By then, Karen had finished the road and was already using it to access the back of her property. But the inspector's face when he saw the mess Karen had made was priceless. Not only had she built without permits, but she had also encroached on protected wetlands that extended into my forest. The next thing I knew, there were fines coming down on her left and right. The county threatened to tear up the road unless she complied with a ton of regulations. And compliance? That was going to cost her tens of thousands of dollars. Karen, of course, was furious. She tried to come at me, screaming that I'd ruined her plans and that she'd sue me for everything I had. That's when I dropped the next bombshell. I was suing her for trespassing and property damage. She didn't see that coming. Karen spent months trying to fight the legal battles, but it didn't end well for her. Not only did she lose the lawsuit, but she was also forced to pay for the removal of the road and restore the damaged wetlands. The restoration process cost her a small fortune, and her shiny new road was torn up, leaving her with nothing but a massive hole in her savings. Her threats of calling 911? Well, they stopped after that. In the end, karma hit Karen hard. She had to put her house up for sale to cover the costs of the legal fees and fines. Last I heard, she moved back to the city, leaving her country life dreams in the dust. And me? I got my land back intact. The trees are still growing, Boone's still running around, and peace has finally returned. I can't say I miss her. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. When I first arrived at college as a freshman, I had no idea what to expect from the people I'd meet or the experiences I'd have. It didn't take long before I met the dorm leader, who in most colleges is an upperclassman responsible for overseeing the freshman halls and ensuring that we all followed the rules. The guy in charge of my floor was named Julio. That's not his real name, but let's go with it for now. At first glance, Julio seemed like a laid-back, friendly type who just wanted to mind his own business. He even told us straight up that he'd stay out of our way as long as we did the same for him. It seemed like a good enough arrangement. Julio often liked to remind us that during his freshman year, he partied hard and drank a lot in the dorms, like it was some rite of passage. He didn't come across as a strict rule enforcer. More like one of those cool guys who didn't really care about the rules as long as we didn't make a mess or draw too much attention. He'd drop hints that he wasn't going to be one of those dorm leaders who was constantly in our business, trying to catch us doing something wrong. I didn't drink much, but it was reassuring to know that he wasn't on a mission to bust people for every little thing. He gave off the vibe that as long as you weren't throwing wild parties, you could get away with a few things. Fast forward to the last week of October during my freshman year. I was a biochemistry major, and that week was brutal for me. I had 3 major exams lined up, and to say I was stressed would be an understatement. After surviving that academic gauntlet, a guy I had just started getting to know, who lived a few doors down, invited me to hang out in his room and watch an NBA game. It sounded like the perfect way to unwind. He had a bottle of vodka, and as we settled in to watch the game, he offered some to the guys who were there. I wasn't big into drinking, but wanting to fit in, I took a single shot. It seemed harmless enough, just a couple of guys chilling and watching a game. As the game went on, one of the guys accidentally knocked over a soda bottle, and in a hurry to clean it up, he rushed to the bathroom to grab some paper towels. On his way out, he ran into Julio, who happened to be walking by at that exact moment. Julio spotted the vodka bottle right away. Instead of making a big deal out of it, though, he just laughed it off. He even said something along the lines of, "I remember being a freshman, just try to keep it down, all right?" We thanked him for not making a fuss, and he went on his way. It seemed like a totally normal interaction. Nothing to worry about. About half an hour later, there's a knock on the door. When we open it, there are 2 police officers standing there, holding breathalyzers. They tell us they've received a report about underage drinking and what they described as a party going on in the dorm. It didn't take long for us to figure out that Julio was the one who called them. I was floored. We weren't throwing a party. There were just 3 of us sitting there watching a Lakers game on a quiet Thursday night. Still, because I had taken that one shot, I ended up blowing a 0.02 on the breathalyzer, which was enough to get me a minor in consumption charge. I was hit with 20 hours of community service, had to write a reflection journal, and was summoned to appear before the school's Judicial Affairs office to discuss what they called my drinking problem. It wasn't the officers I was mad at, they were just doing their job. But Julio, who had acted like he was cool with us just half an hour earlier, had called the cops on us right after that little interaction. That's what really stung. A few weeks later, I couldn't hold back anymore. I ran into Julio in the hallway and decided to confront him about what had happened. I asked him point blank why he didn't just tell us to stop if he had a problem with the alcohol, instead of immediately getting the police involved. His response? Word for word, he said, "You made a decision and had to suffer the consequences of that decision." I remember feeling so frustrated at how smug he sounded. After that, I made it a point to avoid him whenever possible. Oddly enough, despite ratting me out, Julio still tried to be friendly when we passed each other. He'd give me a little nod or say hello like nothing ever happened. But after what he did, I had no interest in being buddy-buddy with him. I finished my freshman year and moved off campus for sophomore year, joining a fraternity where I ended up making some good friends. It wasn't the stereotypical frat scene you'd imagine either. We were at a small college, so fraternities there were more low-key, more about community than crazy parties. By the time my sophomore year rolled around, Julio wasn't even a thought in my head anymore. But then, out of nowhere, I got a text from him during the second semester. He wrote, "One of the guys pledging your fraternity has been caught dealing alcohol to another freshman in the dorms. Just thought I'd let you know." I was a little taken aback by the message. First of all, dealing alcohol sounded absurd. It made the kid sound like some kind of underground bootlegger when really, it was just a minor incident. I thought it was ridiculous and shared the message with the fraternity group chat, where it became a running joke. Everyone got a good laugh out of how dramatic Julio made it sound. But things took a surprising turn from there. A week or so later, the guy who had been pledging our fraternity, let's call him Mark, came up to me with a look of concern on his face. He'd heard about the message Julio had sent me and wanted to know exactly what was going on. He explained that something similar had happened to him, almost identical to what I'd experienced the year before. Julio had caught wind that Mark had shared a bottle of wine with another freshman in the dorms, and sure enough, he reported it. Mark got slapped with a minor in possession charge and had to go through the same frustrating process I had. Meetings with Judicial Affairs, community service, the works. As Mark is telling me all of this, he casually mentioned something that changed everything. During his meeting with Judicial Affairs, he told them that Julio had been in touch with me about his situation before any formal charges were even processed. Now, it turns out that's a pretty big deal. Apparently, dorm leaders are not supposed to discuss any ongoing disciplinary actions or charges against students with anyone outside of the school's judicial system. It's considered a breach of confidentiality. The official who handled Mark's case told him that if he could provide proof that Julio had shared details about the situation with me, a third party, then Julio could face some serious repercussions. The idea of Julio getting in trouble for once, after all his self-righteousness, was almost too good to be true. I didn't waste much time. That same night, I forwarded the text Julio had sent me to the Judicial Affairs office. They responded pretty quickly, and I could tell they were taking it seriously. While I didn't know exactly what would come of it, I had a feeling this wasn't going to end well for Julio. For a while, though, I didn't hear anything more about the situation. Life moved on, and I kind of forgot about it amidst the usual chaos of sophomore year. Then, near the end of the school year, I ran into Julio at the dining hall. To my surprise, he walked straight up to me and started talking. I hadn't really spoken to him since that awkward encounter during freshman year, so I wasn't sure what to expect. What came next caught me completely off guard. Julio launched into this long story about how his life had taken a downward spiral after I reported him to judicial affairs. He told me he had been fired from his position as dorm leader, which meant losing the scholarship money that came with the job. He seemed genuinely upset, telling me how much it had messed up his senior year. He said he was struggling to keep up with tuition payments now that his scholarship was gone, and the stress of it all had really gotten to him. As he spoke, I could sense that he was trying to guilt-trip me into feeling sorry for him. Eventually, after what felt like a full 5-minute sob story, he got to the point. "Why did you do that? This could have been handled completely differently. I didn't have to get fired, and I could have kept my scholarship. We could have worked it out." It was hard to keep a straight face as he spoke, but I managed. After everything that had happened, after how smug and self-righteous he'd been when he'd gotten me in trouble and caused so much unnecessary stress, I was not about to let him play the victim now. I locked eyes with him, holding his gaze for a good long moment. Finally, I repeated back to him the exact same words he had used on me the year before. "Julio, you made a decision and had to suffer the consequences of that decision." The look on his face was priceless. He just stood there, stunned, as if he hadn't expected that at all. For once, he didn't have a snappy comeback or some self-righteous explanation. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away without saying another word. I watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of closure. The rest of that semester went by without any more drama from Julio. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and my fraternity brothers, along with a lot of other people who had their own run-ins with Julio, thought it was hilarious that he'd finally gotten what was coming to him. His days as the dorm leader who was always quick to snitch were over, and I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction in knowing that he'd had to face the consequences of his own actions for once. Looking back, it's strange to think about how much of an impact that one night of watching an NBA game had on the rest of my college experience. It taught me a lot about people and how some will say one thing to your face and then do the complete opposite behind your back. Julio's downfall was mostly his own doing, but it also reminded me of the importance of standing up for yourself when someone tries to throw you under the bus. By the time I was a junior, Julio had more or less faded into the background. He wasn't around campus as much, and no one really talked about him anymore. I'm not sure what he ended up doing after college, but I'd like to think that maybe, just maybe, he learned something from the whole experience. As for me, I moved on with my life, made more friends, and got deeper into my studies, thankful that I didn't have to deal with his antics anymore. At the end of the day, it wasn't about revenge or getting back at him. It was about making sure that people like Julio realized they couldn't just manipulate and lie to others without facing the music. He had set the rules for the game, and in the end, he lost by those very same rules. Junior year brought a new sense of freedom and focus. I was living off campus with some of my fraternity brothers, and life was starting to feel more balanced. Classes were challenging but manageable, and the social scene, while still active, felt less chaotic than those early college days. The whole incident with Julio was fading into a distant memory. It was something we'd joke about occasionally when someone brought it up, but for the most part, I'd moved on. Then, unexpectedly, I crossed paths with him again. This time, it wasn't on campus, but at a party one of my friends was hosting off campus. It was a typical Saturday night, the place packed with familiar faces, and as I made my way through the crowd, I saw Julio standing in the corner, awkwardly nursing a drink. He didn't seem to be having a great time. Maybe he wasn't used to being at parties where he wasn't in some position of authority. I hadn't seen him in a while, and honestly, I was content with keeping it that way. But of course, the universe had other plans. At some point during the night, we ended up in the same circle, and one of my friends, unaware of our history, introduced us like we didn't already know each other. Julio looked at me with a forced smile, probably wondering how I'd react. I just gave him a nod, acknowledging the introduction without making a big deal out of it. I figured that was the end of it. A little while later, though, Julio approached me while I was standing outside by the bonfire. He had this look on his face, like he wanted to clear the air or maybe just get something off his chest. I wasn't exactly thrilled at the idea of having another conversation with him, but curiosity got the better of me, so I stayed put. He started off by saying he knew that we hadn't left things on the best terms, and that he regretted how everything went down. I didn't realize how much it would affect me, he admitted, referring to the fallout from his dorm leader days. He explained that after losing his job and scholarship, it had been tough to make ends meet during his senior year. He had to pick up extra shifts at a local coffee shop just to cover his bills. Life had thrown him a few curveballs after graduation too. Apparently, he had trouble finding a decent job, and his post-college plans hadn't panned out the way he'd hoped. To my surprise, Julio was being vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. He wasn't making excuses and he wasn't trying to pin the blame on anyone else. Instead, he said he realized that he'd handled a lot of situations poorly, especially when it came to how he treated the freshmen in the dorms. "I was trying too hard to be in control," he said, "and I guess it came back to bite me." I didn't know how to respond at first. A part of me wanted to let him off the hook and tell him it was all water under the bridge, but another part of me remembered all the stress and frustration he'd caused, not just for me, but for a lot of other people too. Still, seeing him standing there, clearly struggling with the aftermath of his choices, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. It wasn't about holding on to a grudge anymore. After a long pause, I told him, "I get it. College messes with your head sometimes, and we all do things we regret." I didn't want to make it sound like I was absolving him completely, but I also wasn't looking to rehash the past. "You're not the only one who had to learn some hard lessons." Julio nodded, seeming to appreciate that I wasn't just brushing him off. We talked for a little while longer, mostly about life after college and the challenges of adjusting to the real world. It was the kind of conversation that would have felt impossible a couple of years earlier, but now it just felt like two people trying to make sense of the paths they'd taken. As the night wore on, we both drifted back into the crowd. And that was the last real conversation I had with Julio. It wasn't some dramatic closure, and we didn't become friends after that. But in a way, I think we both got what we needed from that encounter. A chance to let go of some of the tension that had built up over those early years in college. The rest of my junior year went by smoothly. I was getting better at balancing my academics with my social life, and I had started thinking more seriously about what I wanted to do after graduation. The fraternity was still a big part of my life, but I was also making time for other things, like internships and networking events. The future felt a lot closer than it had before, and I was beginning to understand how quickly college was flying by. Senior year came, and with it, a whole new set of challenges and opportunities. I was focused on finishing my degree, but there was also a sense of wanting to make the most of the time I had left. College had taught me a lot, not just academically, but also about how to deal with people, handle conflicts, and move forward after mistakes. Julio had been a big part of that learning process, though not in the way I would have expected when I first met him. I never saw Julio again after that night at the party. I heard bits and pieces from mutual acquaintances. He ended up moving to a different city after graduation, trying to start fresh. Maybe he needed that clean slate, a chance to put the mistakes of college behind him and figure out who he wanted to be without all the baggage of his dorm leader days. As for me, I graduated, found a job, and moved on to the next chapter of my life. Every now and then, when I think back on those college years, I can't help but remember Julio and the strange, winding path our interactions took. In the end, I think we both learned something important about responsibility, consequences, and what it means to grow up. And while it may not have been the story I expected to unfold when I first walked into that dorm as a nervous freshman, it's a story that shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Thank you for watching.